They said it loudly enough for the whole table to hear. Of course she married up, my mother-in-law said, smiling as she cut into her salmon. Not everyone is lucky enough to land a man like Daniel. A few of Daniel's cousins laughed. Someone lifted a glass. Across from me, his sister Rebecca tilted her head and added almost kindly, I mean, it's a big adjustment, right? Coming into a family like ours. No one asked what that meant. They didn't have to. The restaurant was one of those places where the lighting was dim and the waiters spoke softly, but the silence around our table was loud. I felt it settle over me like a weight. Daniel squeezed my hand under the table. Relax, he murmured, barely looking at me. They're joking. But his tone said something else. Not quite agreement. Not quite disagreement. Just distance. I smiled politely and took a sip of water. Before I continue, I'm curious. Have you ever been in a situation where everyone underestimated you? If you have, you're going to understand this story. So hit like, subscribe to Position and Power if you enjoy stories like this, and tell me in the comments what you think happened when I asked that question at the table. Because what happened next, no one in that room was expecting. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, studying me. So, she said, have you decided what you're going to do now? I blinked. About what? Well, she said with a shrug, now that you don't really need to work. More laughter. Someone muttered, that must be nice. I felt my jaw tighten. Daniel finally spoke. Emily's been helping with the property paperwork, he said casually. Rebecca waved that away. Oh, please, she said. Daniel bought that place. She just signs things. More laughter. I stayed quiet. And that was the moment they thought they understood me. But they were wrong. Because the property they were talking about, the house, the land, the entire investment, it wasn't Daniel's. It was mine. The first time Daniel's mother met me, she shook my hand like she was testing something fragile. Emily, she said slowly, Daniel tells us you work in contracts? Property law, I said. Ah. The way she said it sounded polite, but what she meant was something else. Daniel came from money, old money, the kind that hid behind family businesses and investment firms. My parents were school teachers. When Daniel introduced me to his family, his mother smiled warmly and told everyone how refreshing it was that I was so down to earth. Rebecca once described me to a friend as Daniel's grounded phase. They never said anything openly cruel. They didn't need to. It was the little things. At dinners, conversations shifted away from me. When finances came up, someone would joke, "Don't worry, Emily, we'll translate the complicated parts." When Daniel bought his first major investment property 3 years into our marriage, Rebecca toasted him like he'd just conquered something monumental. To Daniel, she said, raising her glass, for continuing the family tradition. No one asked who had structured the deal, who had negotiated the price, who had caught the clause that saved him nearly $500,000 in tax exposure. I sat beside him, smiling quietly. Daniel leaned toward me and whispered, "You don't mind, right?" Mind what? That they, think I did most of it. I shrugged. It doesn't matter. And at the time, it didn't, because Daniel knew the truth. At least I thought he did. The property started as a simple opportunity, a strip of land outside the city that developers had overlooked. Daniel found it through one of his father's contacts. At dinner that night, he said casually, "It could be a good long-term investment." His father nodded approvingly. Rebecca said, "You should buy it before someone else does." Daniel turned to me. "What do you think?" I asked a few questions. Then I spent 3 days researching the zoning changes that were quietly moving through the city council. When I finished, I walked into Daniel's office and said, "If you buy that land now, it'll triple in value within 5 years." He raised an eyebrow. "Really?" "The highway expansion plan goes public next year," I said. "Once that happens, developers will flood the area." Daniel stared at me for a long moment. Then he smiled. "All right," he said. "Let's do it." But when it came time to structure the purchase, I noticed something Daniel didn't. His family's investment firm had certain liabilities attached to it. If the property sat under their umbrella, those liabilities could eventually reach it. So I suggested something simple. "Put it in my name," I said. Daniel laughed. "Why?" "It protects the asset," I said calmly. "Your family business has exposure. This keeps the property clean." He thought about it for a moment. Then he shrugged. "Sure," he said, "if you're comfortable with that." I drafted the contracts myself. Ownership. Emily Carter. Daniel never questioned it again, and neither did his family, because in their minds, I was just the wife. For the first 2 years, the property sat quietly. Taxes paid, no development, no attention. Rebecca occasionally joked about it at family gatherings. "So, Emily," she said once with a smirk, "how's your little paperwork project doing?" Daniel laughed along with her. "It's just land," he said. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came later, when Daniel started repeating their version of the story, at dinners with friends, at business events. He'd gesture casually and say, "Yeah, I picked up some land a few years ago, a long-term play." I would sit beside him, listening. One night, after an event, I asked quietly, "Why do you say it like that?" "Like what?" "Like you bought it." He frowned. "I did buy it." "No," I said calmly. "We bought it." Daniel sighed. "Emily, it's not a big deal." Maybe it wasn't. But something shifted that night, because after that, Daniel stopped mentioning my involvement entirely. At family gatherings, Rebecca would ask, "So Daniel, how's your property investment going?" And Daniel would answer. I stayed quiet. They thought that was the end of it. Then the highway project went public. Within 6 months, the land's value exploded. Developers began calling. Real estate agents left messages daily. One company offered nearly 4 times the original purchase price. Daniel walked into the kitchen one morning, holding his phone like he'd just won the lottery. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "Another offer?" $6 million, he said. I raised an eyebrow. "That's fast." Daniel grinned. I knew it would pay off. I said nothing. Later that week, his parents invited us to dinner. Rebecca was already there when we arrived. "So," she said brightly, "we hear Daniel's property is worth a fortune now." Daniel smiled modestly. "Something like that." His father nodded approvingly. "Well done." Rebecca raised her glass again. To Daniel. I watched the toast happen. I watched Daniel accept it. And that was the moment I realized something important. Daniel believed the story too. The humiliation came 3 weeks later. His parents hosted a large dinner, extended family, business partners, nearly 20 people around the table. Halfway through dessert, Rebecca tapped her glass. "I just want to say something," she announced. Everyone looked up. She smiled at Daniel. "Our brother has officially joined the serious investors of the family." Applause. Rebecca continued. "That land he bought? It's now worth over $6 million. More applause. I felt Daniel's hand on my back. Then Rebecca looked directly at me. "And of course," she added sweetly, "Emily deserves a little credit too." The room quieted slightly. "For what?" someone asked. Rebecca laughed lightly. "Well, she signed the paperwork." The table erupted in laughter. Someone muttered, "Every successful man needs a good assistant." My chest tightened. Daniel chuckled. "Something like that." Rebecca leaned forward. "So Emily," she said, smiling politely, "when Daniel sells the property, I assume you'll help him with the documents again?" I looked at her, then at Daniel. He avoided my eyes. I felt something settle inside me. Not anger, something quieter. Rebecca lifted her glass again. To Daniel. I stayed silent, because they thought that was the end of it. Over the next few weeks, Daniel started talking about selling. "6 million is a good exit," he said one night. "Maybe," I replied. "What do you mean, maybe?" "The zoning hasn't even changed yet," I said. "Once construction starts, it could double again." Daniel shook his head. "Why risk it?" "Because patience matters." He frowned. "You're overthinking it." I didn't argue. Instead, I said something else. "If we sell, we'll need a lawyer." Daniel laughed. "You are a lawyer." "For property structure," I said calmly, "not sale negotiations." He shrugged. Fine." Then he added casually, "But the final decision is mine." I looked at him. "Is it?" He didn't notice the tone. "Of course," he said. And that was the moment I realized how completely he had rewritten the story in his mind. The next family dinner was worse. Rebecca brought a friend who worked in development. They talked openly about the land, numbers, potential profits, future investments. At one point, Rebecca said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Honestly, Emily married up at the perfect time. Imagine walking into a $6 million asset." Laughter. Daniel didn't correct her. I stayed quiet. Rebecca leaned closer. "You're very lucky, you know." "Lucky?" "To marry someone with vision." I smiled politely. "Yes," I said. "I suppose I am." But that wasn't the worst part. Because a week later, Daniel did something unexpected. He scheduled a meeting with a developer, without telling me. I found out the morning of the meeting when he said casually over coffee, "I'm meeting Westbridge Development today." I looked up. "To discuss what?" "The land sale." "Daniel," I said carefully, "we haven't even reviewed their offer." "I don't need to," he said. "6 million is already generous." "And you're planning to sign?" "Not today," he said. "Just talk." I nodded slowly. Then I said something very simple. "Bring the documents home first." Daniel waved his hand dismissively. Relax." I stayed quiet. Because by then, I understood something they didn't. The land, the contracts, the ownership structure, every legal detail they had ignored for 3 years, all of it still said the same thing. Owner, Emily Carter. They just hadn't realized it yet. 2 weeks later, Rebecca hosted another dinner. This time it was larger, more family, more business partners. Daniel seemed excited. Halfway through the evening, Rebecca stood up again. "I have an announcement," she said. The room quieted. She gestured toward Daniel. "Our brother has officially accepted an offer on his property." Applause erupted. Daniel smiled proudly. 6 million, Rebecca added. Someone whistled. Another person said, "Well done." Rebecca turned to me. "And Emily," she said warmly, "thank you for supporting him through the paperwork." More laughter. I felt every pair of eyes on me. Daniel squeezed my shoulder. "Say something," he whispered. I looked around the table, at the people who had spent years quietly dismissing me, at Daniel, who now believed the same version of events they did. Then I said something simple. "Are you sure you've accepted the offer?" Daniel frowned slightly. "Of course." "Have you signed anything yet?" "No," he said. "The formal meeting is next week." Rebecca laughed. "Well then," she said, raising her glass again, "to Daniel's biggest deal yet." The room echoed the toast. I lifted my glass. But I didn't drink, because they still didn't know the most important detail. The property, the asset, the $6 million land deal they were celebrating, wasn't Daniel's to sell. And the meeting next week was going to be very interesting. The room smelled faintly of wine and citrus when the toast ended. Everyone drank. Everyone except me. Daniel leaned closer and whispered, "You're being strange tonight." "Am I?" "Yes." Rebecca was still smiling across the table like she had just hosted a successful show. "You should relax," Daniel said under his breath. "This is a good thing." I looked at him carefully. "You've already decided?" "About selling?" "Yes." "Of course," he said. "$6 million isn't something you hesitate about." I didn't answer, because hesitation had nothing to do with it. But Daniel had already turned back toward his father, who was asking about capital gains projections. The conversation moved on without me. Rebecca's friend from the development firm began discussing zoning approvals. Numbers bounced around the table. 7 million, 8 million after development. Daniel listened like someone hearing his future being described. I sat quietly beside him. Rebecca noticed. She always noticed. "You're awfully quiet tonight, Emily," she said. A few heads turned again. "I'm listening," I replied. Rebecca tilted her head. "You must be excited too." "About what?" "Well," she said, smiling sweetly, "your husband just made $6 million. A few people chuckled. Daniel laughed softly beside me. "It's not final yet," he said. "But it will be," Rebecca replied. Then she turned back to me. "You'll finally understand what it means to marry into a family like ours." Her tone was light, but the meaning was clear. I smiled politely. "I'm sure I will." And that was the moment they thought they had finished the story. But they hadn't even reached the middle. Daniel scheduled the formal meeting 3 days later. Westbridge Development had requested a legal review before finalizing the purchase. "Just routine," Daniel said as he adjusted his tie in the mirror. "You should come," he added casually. "To the meeting?" "Yeah, you know the property better than anyone." I watched him for a moment. "All right," I said. He seemed pleased with that answer, but he didn't notice the pause before I gave it. The Westbridge offices were on the 32nd floor of a glass building downtown. Daniel walked in with the confident energy of someone closing the biggest deal of his life. A receptionist greeted us and led us to a conference room. 2 men were already seated. One of them stood. "Daniel Carter," he said warmly. "Good to finally meet you." They shook hands. The other man nodded politely. "And you must be Emily." "That's right." Daniel began talking immediately. "The property is exactly as described. Clean title, excellent location, future infrastructure already planned." The older man raised a hand gently. "Yes," he said. "About the title." Daniel stopped. The man opened a folder and slid a document across the table. "We did a routine ownership review this morning." Daniel leaned forward. "Good." The man turned the paper toward him. "Just one thing we wanted to clarify." Daniel glanced down. His expression didn't change at first. Then it did. He frowned slightly. "What is this?" The man spoke calmly. "The registered owner of the property is Emily Carter." The room went quiet. Daniel blinked. "That's just a technicality," he said. I said nothing. The second developer looked at me. "Mrs. Carter, can you confirm?" "Yes," I said. Daniel turned toward me slowly. "What does that mean?" "It means the property is legally mine," I said. He stared at me. "For tax purposes," he said quickly. "Partly." The developers exchanged a glance. "Legally speaking," the older man said carefully, "any sale would require Mrs. Carter's approval and signature." Daniel looked between us. "Of course she'll sign," he said. The man nodded politely. "Then we're happy to proceed." Daniel exhaled and leaned back. "See?" he said lightly. But when he looked at me again, his expression was different. Not angry, just confused. The car ride home was quiet. Daniel kept both hands on the steering wheel. Finally, he said, "Why didn't you ever mention that?" I did. "No, you didn't." 3 years ago, I said. "When we bought the land." That was just legal language. It was ownership language. Daniel frowned. So technically it's yours. Yes. But it's still our investment. I looked out the window. We can discuss it. Daniel seemed satisfied with that. He relaxed slightly. Good. Then he added almost jokingly, "You're not planning to keep the money for yourself, are you?" I turned back toward him. No, I said calmly. Of course not. But that wasn't quite the whole truth. Rebecca called 2 days later. Her voice was bright. Daniel told us about the meeting. Oh? Yes, she said. Apparently the property is technically in your name. Technically? Well, she said lightly. Legal details. I didn't correct her. Rebecca laughed softly. You must feel very important. I feel informed. Same thing, she replied. Then she added, Anyway, we're hosting dinner on Saturday. We should celebrate the deal properly. I hesitated. Daniel, sitting across from me, nodded encouragingly. Sure, I said. Wonderful, Rebecca replied. You deserve a toast too. Her voice made it sound like a joke. Saturday night was bigger than the last dinner. More people, more wine. Rebecca had clearly planned it carefully. Daniel looked happy, confident. His father even clapped him on the back when we arrived. 6 million, he said approvingly. Well done. Daniel smiled. Rebecca pulled me aside near the kitchen. I hope you're not feeling awkward about the ownership thing, she said quietly. Why would I? Well, she said, lowering her voice slightly. Everyone knows it's just a formality. I studied her face. Is it? Of course, she said. Then she smiled. You're not going to hold Daniel's investment hostage, are you? I almost laughed. Instead, I said calmly, No. Rebecca seemed relieved. Good. Then she squeezed my arm. Because this family doesn't really appreciate unnecessary complications. I nodded. Noted. Dinner began normally. Wine, conversation, business talk. Halfway through the evening, Rebecca tapped her glass again. The room quieted. I want to congratulate my brother, she said. Applause. Daniel smiled modestly. Rebecca continued. This deal proves something our father always believed. She paused dramatically. That vision runs in the family. More applause. Daniel looked pleased. Then Rebecca glanced at me. And of course, Emily helped with the paperwork. Laughter rippled across the table again. Daniel didn't correct her. Rebecca raised her glass. To Daniel. Everyone followed. Even me. But this time I spoke before anyone drank. There's something we should clarify first. The room paused. Daniel turned toward me slowly. What do you mean? I looked around the table. At Rebecca. At his parents. At the people who had spent years telling the same quiet story about me. Then I spoke calmly. The property everyone is celebrating tonight, I said. Yes? Rebecca smiled. Is not Daniel's investment. The table went silent. Rebecca laughed awkwardly. Emily? No, I said gently. It's mine. No one moved. Daniel stared at me. What are you saying? I reached into my bag and placed a thin folder on the table. Inside were copies of the original contracts, ownership documents, legal registration, every page clearly printed. Owner, Emily Carter. Rebecca looked down at them, then back at me. That doesn't mean anything, she said quickly. It means everything. Daniel's father leaned forward. Emily, he said carefully. Surely you're not suggesting Daniel has no claim here? I'm saying the legal owner of the property, I replied calmly, is me. Daniel finally spoke. Emily, he said quietly. Stop. I met his eyes. No. Rebecca pushed the documents back across the table. This is ridiculous, she said. Is it? Yes, she snapped. Daniel bought the land. No, I said. I structured the purchase. Daniel's voice was tense. We bought it together. I nodded slowly. We invested together. The room held its breath. Then Daniel said something he would later regret. Well, he said, then I assume you'll sign the sale documents. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said quietly, no. The silence that followed felt like gravity. Rebecca blinked. What? I'm not selling. Daniel stared at me. You can't be serious. I am. His father leaned back slowly. Emily, he said, that land is worth $6 million. I know. And you're refusing to sell? Yes. Rebecca laughed nervously. This is absurd. No, I said softly. This is ownership. Daniel's voice hardened. You're embarrassing me. I looked around the table. At this point, I said quietly, I think that ship has sailed. No one spoke. Rebecca's confidence had vanished. Daniel's face had gone pale. And for the first time since I joined that family, they were realizing something they had ignored for years. They had never actually understood who I was, and the story they thought they were telling about me wasn't the real one. Daniel didn't speak on the drive home. Not once. The city lights slid across the windshield while the engine hummed softly beneath us. His hands stayed tight on the steering wheel, his jaw locked in that controlled way I had only seen a few times before. When we reached the house, he parked but didn't turn off the engine. Finally, he said quietly, What was that? I unbuckled my seatbelt. What do you mean? You know exactly what I mean. I waited. You embarrassed me tonight, he said. I corrected something. Daniel turned toward me sharply. In front of my entire family. Yes. You could have said something privately. I did. His eyes narrowed. When? Many times. He shook his head slowly, like he was trying to reset the conversation into something more comfortable. This is getting ridiculous, he said. You're making a legal technicality into some kind of power move. I studied his face. It's not a technicality. It is, he snapped. Everyone knows that. Everyone assumed that. Daniel exhaled hard. So what's the plan then? What do you mean? The land, he said impatiently. The offer. I told you, I'm not selling. His laugh was short and disbelieving. You're serious? Yes. Emily, that property is worth $6 million. I'm aware. And you're just sitting on it? For now. Daniel stared at me. You can't make a decision like that alone. I met his eyes calmly. Legally, I can. The words hung in the car between us. For a moment, he didn't move. Then he finally turned off the engine. Fine, he said coldly. Then we'll talk to a lawyer. I nodded. That sounds like a good idea. Word traveled through Daniel's family faster than I expected. Rebecca called the next morning. Her voice was polite. Too polite. Emily? She said. Rebecca. I wanted to clear up last night. There's nothing to clear up. Well, she said lightly. People left a little confused. That's understandable. Because obviously you're not planning to block a $6 million sale out of spite. I leaned against the kitchen counter. This isn't about spite. Then what is it about? Ownership. Rebecca sighed. You're really going to drag this out. I'm simply exercising my rights. Emily, she said slowly, families don't usually behave like this. I almost smiled. No, I said. They usually behave much worse. She didn't respond to that. Instead, she said something else. You realize Daniel's father helped him secure that land? I remember the conversation. And Daniel put up most of the capital. Yes. So legally or not, she said, That investment belongs to him. Legally, I replied. It belongs to me. Silence stretched across the line. Rebecca finally said, "You're making a mistake." "Maybe. You're turning this into a power struggle." I thought about that for a moment. Then I said calmly, "No. You already turned it into one." And I hung up. Daniel returned home late that night. He loosened his tie while walking into the living room. "We need to fix this," he said immediately. I closed my laptop. "What needs fixing?" "You refusing to sign the sale." "I didn't refuse." "You said no." "I said not now." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "You're jeopardizing a deal." "I'm protecting an asset." He stopped pacing. "For what?" "Timing." He stared at me. "Emily, developers are already circling that land." "I know." "Then what are you waiting for?" I folded my hands calmly. "The zoning vote." Daniel blinked. "What zoning vote?" "The commercial expansion vote scheduled next quarter." His expression changed slightly. "That's just speculation." "No," I said. "It's paperwork." He studied me more carefully now. "Why didn't you mention that before?" "You never asked." Daniel sank into the chair across from me. "So you think the land will go up again?" "Yes." "How much?" "At least double." His eyes widened. 12 million? Possibly more. The room went quiet. For the first time since the dinner, Daniel wasn't angry. He was thinking. "You're sure?" "As sure as zoning documents allow." Daniel leaned back slowly. "And you didn't tell anyone?" "No." "Why?" I looked at him. "Because they weren't listening." For a few weeks, things settled into a tense quiet. Daniel stopped mentioning the sale. Rebecca stopped calling. But the pressure didn't disappear. It just changed shape. Daniel's father requested a meeting. "Just the three of us," Daniel said one evening. "At the office." I agreed. His father's office sat on the top floor of the family investment building. Dark wood walls, quiet lighting. The kind of place designed to make decisions feel serious. When we walked in, he stood behind his desk. "Emily," he said politely. "Mr. Carter." "Sit." We sat. Daniel looked tense. His father folded his hands. "I've reviewed the property documents." "That's good." He nodded slowly. "You structured the purchase well." "Thank you." "But I'm concerned." "About what?" "You holding the asset indefinitely." "I'm not holding it indefinitely." "Then why delay the sale?" "Because the land will increase in value." Daniel shifted slightly. His father watched me closely. "You're certain of that?" "Yes." "Based on zoning speculation." "Based on confirmed infrastructure planning." The older man leaned back in his chair. "You're asking my son to wait for a gamble." "I'm asking him to wait for information." Daniel spoke then. "How long?" 6 months. His father looked displeased. "That's unnecessary risk." "No," I said calmly. "It's strategic patience." The room stayed quiet for a moment. Then his father said something that changed everything. Emily." "Yes?" "If you insist on controlling this decision..." He paused. "Then perhaps it's time we restructure ownership." Daniel looked up. "What do you mean?" His father's gaze stayed on me. "The family investment firm can buy out Emily's share." I felt Daniel's attention shift toward me. "How much?" he asked. His father named a number. 3 million, half the current market offer. The room went still. Daniel turned to me. "That's fair," he said quickly. "It gives you profit and lets us move forward." I looked at him. "You think that's fair?" "You double your money." "And give up the asset?" "Yes." I leaned back slowly. "No." Daniel's father's voice hardened slightly. Emily, refusing reasonable offers will create problems. Problems for who? For the family. I met his gaze evenly. I'm not part of the family investment firm. The silence after that was thick. Then his father said quietly, "You're Daniel's wife." Yes. That makes you family. Does it? He didn't like that question. Daniel rubbed his forehead. This is getting ridiculous, he said. It's really not, I replied. Then I reached into my bag and placed another folder on the desk. Daniel looked at it. What's that? Documentation. His father opened it. Inside were city planning records, infrastructure contracts, environmental reports, highway expansion schedules, and one final document, a preliminary development interest letter from a major commercial group. Estimated project value, $22 million. Daniel's father's eyes narrowed slightly. Where did you get this? Public records, I said calmly. Daniel leaned forward. $22 million? Potential development value. He stared at the numbers. You knew about this? Yes. And you didn't tell anyone? No. Why? I looked at him carefully. Because you stopped listening to me a long time ago. The room stayed silent. For the first time since all of this started, Daniel looked uncertain, and his father looked thoughtful. But the real moment hadn't come yet, because the final reversal was still waiting. And when it arrived, it wouldn't happen at a dinner table. It would happen somewhere far more official. Daniel didn't speak during the drive home from his father's office, not because he was angry, because he was thinking. I could see it in the way he kept glancing at the folder on the passenger seat, the one with the infrastructure reports and the $22 million development estimate. When we pulled into the driveway, he finally said quietly, "You had all of that for months." Yes. And you didn't tell me. I tried. Daniel shut off the engine. That's not the same. I turned toward him. You stopped asking my opinion about a year ago. He didn't argue. Instead, he said something else. If that development group is serious, they are. Then the land could be worth much more than $12 million. Yes. Daniel leaned back in his seat slowly. For how long have you known that? 7 months. His jaw tightened. 7 months. Yes. And during that entire time, you let my family believe I was the one running the deal. That's what they believed. You could have corrected them. I did. Daniel stared at me. Not enough. I didn't respond to that, because the truth was simpler. People rarely hear corrections they don't want. For the next few weeks, something changed in Daniel. He stopped talking about selling the land. He stopped repeating Rebecca's jokes about his investment. He even corrected someone once at a dinner with friends. Well, he said carefully, Emily actually structured the whole purchase. The words sounded unfamiliar coming from him, but I noticed something else too. His family stopped inviting us to large gatherings. Rebecca called less. Daniel's father stopped sending casual investment updates. Silence settled in. Not peaceful silence. Watchful silence. They were waiting, and so was I. 3 months later, the zoning vote passed. Quietly. Without much media attention. But within 48 hours, everything changed. Commercial developers began contacting us again. Different companies, different numbers. 8 million, 9 million. One offer reached 11. Daniel walked into the kitchen one morning holding his phone again, just like he had months earlier. This is insane, he said. What happened? Riverside Commercial Group. I looked up. What about them? They want a meeting. I waited. Daniel exhaled. They're talking about a development partnership. How big? He hesitated. Potentially 20 million. The number sat between us like a quiet explosion. Daniel watched my reaction carefully. You knew this would happen. Yes. And you waited? Yes. He nodded slowly. I understand now. But understanding something privately wasn't the same as admitting it publicly, and that moment hadn't happened yet. 2 weeks later, Rebecca called. Her voice was carefully neutral. Emily. Rebecca. I heard about the new offers. I imagine you did. Yes, she said. Father mentioned it. I waited. Then she said the thing she had been rehearsing. We're hosting dinner on Saturday. I almost smiled. Another one? Yes. Her tone tightened slightly. This time we want to discuss things properly. Who's coming? Family, Daniel's father, a few advisors. I thought about that for a moment. All right, I said. I'll come. Saturday evening looked strangely familiar. The same long table, the same expensive wine, the same carefully arranged seating. But the mood was different. Daniel's father sat at the head of the table. Rebecca sat across from me. Daniel sat beside me, unusually quiet. No one mentioned the land at first. They waited through appetizers, through the first course. Finally, Rebecca tapped her glass, not as confidently as before. Before we continue, she said, we should probably address the situation. No one laughed this time. Daniel's father folded his hands. Emily, he said calmly, we understand the property has increased in value significantly. Yes. And that Riverside Commercial has expressed interest. Yes. He nodded slowly. The potential development value is impressive. I said nothing. Rebecca spoke next. What my father means, she said carefully, is that the family should probably coordinate how this deal moves forward. Coordinate? Yes, she said. Strategically. Daniel looked at me briefly, but didn't interrupt. Rebecca continued. After all, Daniel originally found the property. That's true. And our father helped finance it. Yes. So obviously, she said, leaning forward slightly, the investment belongs within the family structure. I tilted my head. What family structure? Rebecca blinked. Our investment firm. Ah. Her smile tightened. You understand what I mean? Yes, I said. And? And the property isn't owned by your firm. Silence spread across the table. Daniel's father spoke carefully. Emily, no one is disputing the paperwork. Good. But from a practical perspective, this project requires significant resources. I agree. Rebecca leaned forward again. Which is why the family should manage it. Why? Her patience cracked slightly. Because that's how these things work. I met her eyes calmly. No, I said. That's how you assumed they worked. Daniel shifted slightly beside me. Rebecca exhaled. So, what exactly is your plan? I looked around the table. At Daniel. At his father. At Rebecca. Then I said something very simple. The development partnership has already been structured. Daniel's father frowned. What do you mean? I mean, I said calmly, Riverside and I finalized preliminary agreements last week. Rebecca blinked. You what? Daniel looked at me sharply. You didn't tell me that. I was going to. When? Tonight. The table went completely still. Daniel's father leaned forward. You signed something? A conditional development agreement. Rebecca's voice rose slightly. You made a $20 million decision without consulting the family? I shook my head gently. I consulted the owner. Daniel stared at me. You. Yes. The silence that followed was heavier than any moment before it. Rebecca looked like she was searching for a flaw in the statement. Finally, she said, You're making a mistake. Maybe. You don't have the experience to run something like this. I do. You're a property lawyer. She snapped. Yes. This is commercial development. Yes. Rebecca laughed softly. You think you can manage that alone? I'm not alone. Daniel's father narrowed his eyes. Who's your partner? I slid a document across the table. He opened it. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Riverside Commercial Group had named me as the primary project partner. Estimated development value, $22 million. Projected personal equity, $11 million. Daniel leaned over to read it. His expression changed slowly. Rebecca's face went pale. This can't be real, she said. It is. Daniel looked at me quietly. You're leading the project. Yes. And I'm… what? I held his gaze. That depends on you. The room stayed silent. Rebecca finally said weakly, so Daniel doesn't even control his own investment anymore. I turned toward her. It was never his. No one argued this time, because now the paperwork was on the table, and everyone could see it. Daniel leaned back slowly. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then he said quietly, You really planned all of this? Yes. How long? Since the day we bought the land. Rebecca stared at me like she was seeing me for the first time. Daniel's father closed the folder carefully. Then he said something no one expected. Well done. Rebecca turned toward him in shock. Father… But he raised a hand. She protected the asset. He looked at me again and increased its value. Rebecca was speechless. Daniel sat quietly beside me. Not angry, not embarrassed, just thoughtful. The dinner ended early after that. No one toasted. No one joked. When Daniel and I walked to the car, the night air felt strangely calm. He opened the door for me. Then he paused. I owe you an apology. I waited. I should have listened to you. Yes, I said softly. He nodded once. I know. We drove home quietly, but this silence felt different. Not tense, not defensive, just honest. Because the truth had finally become impossible to ignore. For years, they believed I had married into power, that I had simply stepped into their world and benefited from it. But the truth was simpler. I hadn't married into power. I had quietly built it. And the moment they finally realized that, I no longer needed their approval, or their permission, or their assumptions. I had something much better: ownership, and the quiet freedom that came with it.